There is a moment in every avoidance emotional journey that almost no one recognizes while it's happening. It doesn't come with a conversation, a confession, or even a visible change in behavior that you can clearly point to. On the surface, it looks like distance, maybe even disinterest. But internally, something far more significant is unfolding. This is what I call the silent shift, the point where confusion begins to crystallize into a decision. Avoidants don't process emotions in real time the way most people expect. They don't sit across from you and articulate what they're feeling as it happens. Instead, they step back, they create space, and in that space, they begin to observe, not just you, but themselves. What feels overwhelming to you is for them necessary. It's how they regulate. It's how they make sense of emotional intensity without losing their sense of control. And here's where most people get it wrong. They interpret that space as a sign that something is breaking down. In reality, it may be the first sign that something is being taken seriously, because when an avoidant starts to consider that you might actually matter, that's when the internal shift begins. They stop reacting impulsively and start evaluating quietly. Every interaction you've had, every moment of closeness, every instance of pressure or patience, it all gets replayed, but not in a dramatic way. It's subtle, almost analytical. They're asking themselves questions they would never say out loud. Do I feel safe here? Am I being pulled into something I can't control? Or is this someone who allows me to exist without losing myself? This is not a quick process. It's slow, deliberate, and often invisible. And because it's invisible, it's easy to misread. You might feel them becoming more distant, less expressive, harder to reach. You might assume they're losing interest or pulling away for good, but what's actually happening is that they're pulling inward, trying to understand the weight of what they're feeling without being overwhelmed by it. Avoidants are highly sensitive to anything that feels like pressure, even if that pressure is unintentional. So during this stage, they become hyper-aware, not just of your actions, but of your expectations. They're watching for emotional demands, for signs that they might be required to move faster than they're ready for. And at the same time, they're noticing something else: consistency, stability, whether your presence feels grounding or consuming. This is why the shift is so quiet. There's no announcement because they don't fully trust the feeling yet. They're not trying to involve you in the process. They're trying to understand it privately first. And until they do, what you see externally may feel like a step back. But it's not always a step back. Sometimes it's the only way they know how to move forward without shutting down completely. The paradox is that the more this starts to matter, the less expressive they may become in the moment. Not because the feeling isn't there, but because it's becoming significant enough to require protection. They are, in their own way, deciding whether this connection can exist without threatening their autonomy, their emotional safety, their identity. And that decision doesn't happen through words. It happens through observation, through distance, through silence. So if you misunderstand this stage, if you react to their withdrawal with pressure, urgency, or emotional escalation, you interrupt the very process that might have led them to choose you. But if you understand it, if you allow space without abandoning presence, you become something rare in their experience. Someone who doesn't force the decision but makes it easier. Because in the end, the silent shift is not about distance. It's about discernment. And those who recognize it don't chase clarity. They become the reason clarity arrives. What makes this stage even more complex is that while you may be looking for expression, they are engaged in evaluation. Not the kind of evaluation that's spoken out loud or shared in real time, but a quiet internal assessment that runs beneath the surface of every interaction. Avoidants don't move toward decisions through emotional declarations. They move through observation, pattern recognition, and a kind of psychological filtering that most people never see. They are not asking, do I like this person, in a simple or romantic sense. The questions are far more layered than that. They are asking, what does this connection do to my internal state? Do I feel grounded after interacting with this person? Or do I feel drained, pressured, or exposed? And perhaps most importantly, can I exist in this connection without losing control over myself? This is why their behavior can feel so contradictory. You might have moments of genuine closeness, conversations that feel deep, even intimate. And then without warning, they seem to pull back, becoming distant or harder to reach. To someone on the outside, it feels inconsistent, even confusing. But internally, it's part of a process. They are collecting data. Every interaction becomes a point of reference. If you respond to their silence with anxiety or pressure, they register that. If you respond with calmness and self-possession, they register that too. They're not necessarily judging you in a harsh or critical way, but they are noticing how your behavior impacts their sense of emotional safety. And for an avoidant, safety is not about closeness. It's about not feeling overwhelmed. There's a philosophical layer to this that often goes unspoken. Avoidants are, in many ways, trying to reconcile two opposing needs: the desire for connection and the need for autonomy. These are not mild preferences. They are deeply ingrained psychological drives. And when those drives come into conflict, the avoidant doesn't resolve it externally. They turn inward. So while you may be waiting for reassurance, they are measuring consistency. While you may want clarity, they are observing emotional pacing. They are asking themselves whether this connection escalates too quickly, whether it demands more than they can comfortably give, or whether it allows space for them to remain intact as an individual. And here's the part that most people misunderstand. They are not only evaluating you, they are evaluating themselves in relation to you. They are noticing how they react, how they feel after spending time with you, whether they experience tension or ease. Because for them, choosing someone is not just about liking that person, it's about whether the relationship disrupts or stabilizes. Their internal world, this is why words mean less than patterns during this stage. You can say all the right things, express all the right intentions, but if your behavior introduces pressure, unpredictability, or emotional volatility, that becomes the louder signal. On the other hand, if your presence feels consistent, grounded, and non-demanding, that creates a different kind of impact, one that doesn't trigger their defenses. It's important to understand that this evaluation is not rushed. Avoidants take time because they are trying to avoid making a decision they'll later feel trapped by. They are cautious, sometimes to a fault, but that caution is rooted in a deep need to protect their independence and emotional equilibrium. So when you find yourself questioning their silence or their lack of clear expression, recognize what may actually be happening. They are not absent. They are attentive in a different way. They are not disengaged. They are processing at a level that doesn't require your immediate involvement. And if you try to force expression before they've completed that internal evaluation, you create resistance. Not because they don't care, but because the process has been interrupted. Understanding this changes how you show up. It shifts you from trying to extract reassurance to embodying stability. It moves you away from reacting to what is said or not said, and toward recognizing the deeper pattern that is being formed. Because in the end, avoidants don't choose based on what they hear in the moment. They choose based on what they consistently feel over time. And if your presence becomes synonymous with clarity instead of pressure, you won't need to ask where you stand, because their decision will already be made. As this internal evaluation deepens, something else begins to surface. Something far more intense and far more misunderstood. It's the tensi, on between two forces that cannot easily coexist: the desire to attach and the instinct to protect. This is where the real conflict begins, and it's precisely the stage where most people misinterpret what they're seeing. Because when an avoidant starts to feel something real, something that goes beyond surface level interest, it doesn't create immediate closeness. It creates pressure, not external pressure necessarily, but internal pressure. The kind that comes from realizing, often unconsciously, that this connection has the potential to matter. And for an avoidant, mattering is not a simple or comfortable experience. It introduces risk of dependence, risk of vulnerability, risk of loss. And so instead of leaning in, they often do the opposite. They create distance, not because the feeling isn't there, but because it is. This is the paradox that confuses so many people. You expect that deeper emotion leads to greater presence, more communication, more consistency. But for an avoidant, deeper emotion can trigger the exact opposite response. It's not a game, it's not manipulation, it's a form of self-regulation. You have to understand that for someone with avoidant tendencies, closeness is not just comforting, it's also destabilizing. It begins to challenge their sense of independence, their need for control over their own emotional state. And when that balance feels threatened, their system responds the only way it knows how, by pulling back. So you may notice a shift. They become less available, less expressive, more contained. Conversations that once flowed easily may feel more guarded. The warmth is still there, but it's restrained. And from the outside, it can look like disinterest or detachment. But internally, it's something very different. Internally, they are navigating a conflict that feels almost philosophical in nature. One part of them recognizes the value of the connection. There's a pull toward it, a sense that this could be meaningful, even grounding. But another part of them is activated by the implications of that meaning. Because to fully step into the connection would require a level of openness that feels unfamiliar, even unsafe. So they oscillate. They move closer, then step back. They engage, then withdraw. Not because they're unsure about you, but because they're unsure about what it will cost them to let you in. And this is where the misunderstanding becomes dangerous. Because when you interpret their distance as rejection, you may respond with urgency, seeking reassurance, pushing for clarity, trying to close the gap. But that response, while completely natural, amplifies the very fear they're trying to manage. To them, it confirms the idea that closeness comes with pressure. That emotional connection will eventually demand something they're not ready to give. And so they retreat further, not away from you, but away from the intensity of the situation. The deeper truth is that attachment for an avoidant is not just about connection. It's about exposure. It's about stepping into a space where they can no longer rely solely on themselves for emotional regulation. And that's a profound shift, one that doesn't happen easily and certainly not quickly. So when they begin to feel that shift, their instinct is to slow everything down, to create enough distance to regain clarity, to ensure that what they're feeling doesn't override their ability to remain in control of their own experience. And if that space is respected, if it's not filled with pressure or misinterpretation, they begin to process the feeling rather than defend against it. Because the truth is, they're not trying to escape the connection. They're trying to understand if they can exist within it without losing themselves. And hats the real battle, not between you and them, but within them. A battle between the fear of losing control and the quiet recognition that some connections are worth the risk. And the outcome of that battle doesn't depend on how tightly you hold on. It depends on whether your presence feels like freedom, not force. As this internal conflict continues to unfold, something subtle but incredibly important begins to happen. Behavior that looks inconsistent on the surface, but is actually deeply revealing beneath it. This is the phase where avoidants begin to test, though not in the deliberate and manipulative way people often assume. These are not calculated gains. They are unconscious strategies designed to answer one central question. Is this connection safe enough for me to stay in? It's through observation of your reactions. It's through observation of your reactions. You may notice that their behavior becomes less predictable. One moment they're present, engaged, even warm. The next, they seem distant, slower to respond, or emotionally unavailable. To someone experiencing this, it can feel destabilizing. You start to question the connection, wondering what changed, what you did wrong, or whether the interest is fading. But from their perspective, nothing random is happening. They are creating space, sometimes intentionally, sometimes instinctively, to see what fills it. When they pull back slightly, they're watching. Not in a critical or judgmental way, but in a protective one. They're observing whether that space is met with pressure or with composure. Whether their temporary distance triggers anxiety, pursuit, or emotional escalation, or whether it's met with steadiness and self-containment. Because for an avoidant, the greatest threat is not conflict, it's engulfment. The feeling that a relationship will demand more than they can and give more than they can regulate, more than they can control. So these moments of inconsistency are not about pushing you away permanently. They're about gathering evidence. They are asking without words, if I step back, will this person collapse into me or will they remain grounded in themselves? And this is where most people understandably struggle, because when faced with inconsistency, the natural reaction is to seek stability, to ask questions, to close the gap, to regain a sense of certainty. But that very reaction, while human, can confirm the avoidance underlying fear. That closeness comes with expectation, that connection leads to pressure. On the other hand, when their space is met with calmness, not indifference, but emotional stability, it creates a different experience entirely. It shows them that connection doesn't have to mean losing autonomy. That presence can exist without demand. And this is what they're trying to verify, often without even realizing it themselves. It's important to understand that these tests are not pass or fail in the traditional sense. They're cumulative. They build over time. Each interaction, each response, each moment of tension or ease becomes part of a larger pattern that they're quietly interpreting. If the pattern suggests volatility, urgency, or emotional dependence, their defenses strengthen. But if the pattern suggests consistency, patience, and self-assuredness, something begins to shift internally. The connection starts to feel less threatening, more sustainable. This is why their behavior during this stage can feel so confusing. You're responding to what you see externally, while they're responding to what they feel internally. And those two realities don't always align in obvious ways, but beneath it all, there is a kind of logic, a psychological coherence that becomes clear once you understand the underlying motivation. They are not trying to create distance for the sake of it. They are trying to determine whether closeness can exist without cost. So the question is not whether they will test the connection. The question is how that connection responds when it's not being constantly reinforced. Because in those moments of space, of silence, of reduced availability, something important is revealed, not just about them, but about you. And in the end, the connection doesn't deepen because you proved how much you needed them. It deepens because you showed them they could choose you without feeling like they had to. If you follow this process all the way through, the distance, the internal evaluation, the push and pull, the subtle testing, you arrive at a point that is almost invisible from the outside, yet normative on the inside. There is a moment where all the observation, all the internal conflict, all the quiet analysis converges into a decision. And the most important thing to understand is this: that decision is rarely spoken. There is no dramatic turning point, no clear declaration that says, I've chosen you or I'm walking away. Instead, it happens in a way that is deeply internal, almost imperceptible unless you know what to look for. It's a shift in certainty, a quiet resolution that settles beneath the surface of their behavior. They reach a point where the question is no longer, what is this, but can I live with this? And that question is everything, because avoidants are not searching for intensity. They're not even searching for perfection. They are searching for sustainability, for something that doesn't overwhelm their system, doesn't threaten their autonomy, doesn't force them into a version of themselves they don't recognize. So when they make a decision, it's not based on a peak emotional moment. It's based on accumulated experience. Every interaction you've had up to this point has contributed to that internal conclusion. The way you handled distance, the way you responded to inconsistency, the way you showed up when things were unclear, all of it becomes part of a pattern that they can either trust or retreat from. And when that pattern begins to feel safe, consistently, not occasionally, they start to settle. Not in a loud or expressive way, but in a grounded, almost understated shift. You may notice it in small changes, a bit more presence, a little more openness, a subtle increase in consistency. Nothing exaggerated, nothing overwhelming. Just a quiet leaning in. But here's what's critical. By the time you see those changes, the decision has already been made. Because avoidants don't move forward while they're still unsure. They resolve that uncertainty internally first. They need to know, at least to a degree that feels stable, that choosing this connection won't come at the cost of their internal balance. And once they reach that conclusion, their behavior begins to align with it. The same is true in the opposite direction. If the pattern they've observed feels too intense, too unpredictable, or too demanding, they also reach a decision. And just like before, it won't come with a clear explanation. It will show up as increased distance, reduced engagement, a gradual fading of presence. Not as a punishment, but as a form of self-preservation. This is why this stage is so often misunderstood. People wait for a conversation that never comes. They look for clarity in words when the clarity has already been established in behavior. And because it's not spoken, it's easy to believe that things are still undecided, that there's still time to influence the outcome through effort, through persuasion, through intensity. But in reality, the window for influence was never in the moment of decision. It was in everything that came before it. That's the philosophical weight of this stage. It reveals something fundamental about human connection, that the most important choices people make about each other are rarely made in the spotlight. They are made quietly over time through repeated emotional experiences that either build trust or reinforce fear. So when you think about where you stand, don't look for a single defining moment. Look at the pattern that has been forming. Look at the emotional environment that has been created between you, because that is what they're responding to. And once that internal decision is made, it doesn't shift easily, not because they are rigid, but because they have taken the time to arrive at it carefully, Changing it would mean re-entering the very uncertainty they work to resolve, which brings you to a simple but powerful realization. You are not chosen in a moment. You are chosen in a pattern. And by the time the choice becomes visible, it has already been decided in silence. And this brings us to the part of the process that is perhaps the most consequential, not because of what the avoidant is doing, but because of how it is perceived. This is where everything we've talked about becomes vulnerable to misinterpretation. Because from the outside, this entire stage can look like one thing when internally it is something else entirely. Most people see distance and assume disinterest. They see silence and assume detachment. They feel inconsistency and interpret it as a lack of care. And to be fair, those interpretations are not irrational. They're based on how most people communicate. In many relational dynamics, reduced effort does signal reduced investment. But with avoidance, the external behavior often does not match the internal experience. What looks like emotional withdrawal can actually be emotional overload. What feels like indifference can be internal conflict. And what appears to be a lack of clarity can, in reality, be a process of quiet decision-making that has not yet surfaced in a visible way. This is where the disconnect happens. You respond to what you can see while they were operating from what they feel internally. And because those two layers are out of sync, reactions on both sides begin to reinforce the very outcome neither may have intended. If you interpret their distance as rejection, your instinct may be to close that distance, to seek reassurance, to ask for clarity, to reestablish connection. But to them, that response can feel like escalation, not because your need is invalid, but because it accelerates the emotional pace beyond what they are able to process comfortably. On the other side, if you interpret their behavior as a sign to withdraw completely, cutting off, becoming cold, or mirroring their distance in a reactive way, you may unintentionally confirm another fear. That connection is unstable, that people disappear. Hat closeness is not something that can be relied upon. So in both cases, the reaction, though understandable, feeds into the avoidance underlying concerns. Either it becomes too much or becomes too uncertain. And this is why this stage is so pivotal. Not because it determines everything on its own, but because it amplifies whatever pattern is already forming. Misinterpretation doesn't just create confusion, it actively shapes the outcome. There's a deeper philosophical layer here that's worth understanding. Human beings don't just respond to reality, they respond to their interpretation of reality. And when two people are operating from entirely different internal frameworks, the same behavior can carry completely different meanings. To you, asking for clarity may feel like emotional responsibility. To them, it may feel like pressure. To you, stepping back may feel like self-respect. To them, it may feel like abandonment. So the question becomes, how do you navigate a dynamic where the visible signals are unreliable indicators of the internal truth? The answer is not to ignore your own needs, and it's not to over-accommodate theirs. It's to recognize the pattern beneath the behavior, to understand that what matters most in this stage is not any single moment, but the overall emotional environment being created. Are you responding in a way that stabilizes the connection or in a way that intensifies uncertainty? Because that is ultimately what determines how this stage resolves. When this process is misunderstood, people tend to react in extremes, either chasing harder, withdrawing completely, and both extremes move the connection away from balance. But when it's understood, something different becomes possible. You begin to respond with intention rather than impulse. You stop trying to force clarity and instead allow it to emerge through consistency. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, is powerful because it aligns your behavior not with what you fear is happening, but with what is actually unfolding beneath the surface. In the end, this stage doesn't break connections because of what the avoidant feels. It breaks them because of how those feelings are misunderstood and reacted to. And the difference between losing the connection and deepening it often comes down to one simple truth. Those who misread the silence react to it. Those who understand it transform it. By the time you reach the end of this process, something becomes undeniably clear. This was never just about the avoidant. It was about perception, patience, and the ability to understand what isn't being said as much as what is. Because every stage we've explored, the silent shift, the internal evaluation, the battle between fear and attachment, the unconscious testing, and the quiet decision leads to one central realization. Avoidants do not move through connection the way most people expect, but they do move with intention. It's just not expressed in obvious ways. And that's where most people lose the connection. Not because it wasn't meaningful, but because it wasn't understood. They react to distance instead of decoding it. They push for clarity instead of allowing it to form. They interpret silence as rejection instead of recognizing it as processing. But when you begin to see the deeper structure behind these behaviors, everything changes. You stop chasing moments and start recognizing patterns. You stop demanding answers and start embodying stability. You stop trying to force the connection forward and instead create the conditions where it can move naturally. Because here's the truth that most people overlook. An avoidant doesn't choose the person who pressures them into closeness. They choose the person who makes closeness feel safe. Not B. Why saying more? Not by doing more, but by being someone whose presence doesn't trigger their need to escape. And that requires something deeper than strategy. It requires self-awareness, emotional control, the ability to remain grounded even when things feel uncertain. Because in a dynamic like this, your reactions don't just express your feelings, they shape the entire direction of the connection. So the question is no longer, how do I make them choose me? The real question is, what kind of presence am I bringing into this space? Because in the end, avoidants don't decide based on intensity. They decide based on how they consistently feel around you over time. And when your presence becomes associated with clarity instead of confusion, calm instead of pressure, and freedom instead of expectation, something shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively. They stop questioning whether they should stay and start realizing they don't want to leave. And that is the moment everything changes. So don't chase the decision. Become the reason it feels right.